So today I want to talk about the humanity of Jesus and also a few events that happened during his crucifixion. Crucifixion is a big part of the New Testament. Jesus' humanity is just as important as the deity of Jesus. It's really hard for us as humans to grasp this concept, but Jesus was born a man while still being completely divine at the same time. Now, a lot of times pastors will speak on all the divine things Jesus did, which are extremely important, don't get me wrong. But it's also important for us as you study the Bible and try to learn new things to think about Jesus the man. So before we get in too deep, let's talk about why it was necessary for Jesus to be a man. Galatians 4 through 5 says, "But when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under law, to redeem those under law, that we might receive the full rights of sons." So let's break this down a little bit. We have really two things to point out here. Number one being, only a man could be born under law. Beasts, animals, they're not under law, and angels aren't under law. So that means it would take a man to redeem other human beings born under law. Number two, Jesus' humanity really helped him to relate to us in a way that neither an angel nor an animal would be able to understand. Only a human being would be able to sympathize with our weaknesses. Jesus understood temptation. As a human, he was subjected to the same trials we are. And as a result of those things, Jesus was able to sympathize with us. Hebrews 4:15, let's look at this, says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet was without sin." So that really backs that up. So Paul Enns says in the Moody Handbook of Theology, quote, "He was tempted, he was persecuted, he was poor, he was despised, he suffered physical pain, and he endured the sorrows of a lingering and most cruel death. Only a human being could experience these things, and only a human being could fully understand them through experience." Something to think about. Now, there are other reasons Jesus' humanity was important, and I encourage you to do some reading and examine this, because the importance of Jesus' humanity is a strong basis from everything, all the way from the time he was born up to the time he died. I just wanted to kind of touch on that, do a little brief survey so that you could get a small grasp of the importance of his humanity. Now, I want to talk about three events in particular, three things that happened during Jesus' crucifixion. Now, Jesus' crucifixion was extremely gruesome. It was very gruesome. But as Gary DeLachement says in a public speaking event, he said, quote, "It wasn't very dramatic," meaning that it went off without a hitch. So it was very gruesome, but it went off exactly as it was supposed to. Nothing went wrong. This is how it was supposed to be. There were three uniquely dramatic events that occurred, and understood in the light of the Old Testament and Jesus' own words from the cross, they help us to understand the meaning of Jesus' death. And Matthew recorded all three of these events in Matthew 27. He wrote his gospel in part to prove to Jewish countrymen that Jesus was the Messiah. And these dramatic events were part of his proof. This was his proof to them. Now keep in mind, there are hundreds of parallels in the Bible between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Hundreds. It's really unique and interesting to see how they connect. It's something that I could talk about for hours. There's so many parallels. Now the first event we're going to talk about was darkness at midday. So, just guessing in the timeline, most theological scholars believe that Jesus' crucifixion started around 9 a.m. And you can kind of reference Mark 15:25 for that. So for the next 3 hours, Jesus' enemies mocked him. They made fun of him, called him names. And then at noon, something remarkable happened. For 3 hours, from about noon to 3 p.m., darkness fell upon the land. So what was the midday darkness? It wasn't a solar eclipse, because they don't last for more than a few minutes. It couldn't have lasted for 3 hours. And the astronomical calculations rule out a solar eclipse for the 30 and 33 AD crucifixion dates, which is around the time that scholars believe Jesus was crucified. And Matthew says it fell upon the land, so he referenced the area including and even beyond Palestine. So there's a lot of extra biblical evidence for this event. The Christian apologist Tertullian wrote in the 2nd century, and he called it a cosmic or world event. It was evident in Rome and Athens, the Mediterranean cities, and challenged his non-Christian adversaries with these words: "At the moment of Christ's death, the light departed from the sun, and the land was darkened at noonday. Which wonder is related in your own annals and is preserved in your archives to this day." So we have the gospel authors, and then we have other historical sources that agree that this unprecedented midday darkness occurred during Jesus' crucifixion. So what does it mean? So the answer is clear if you kind of read it in context and in the light of the Old Testament. Jesus was under God's judgment. So if you go back to the Old Testament, darkness in the Old Testament a lot of times signifies God's judgment. You can look at the book of Amos. Furthermore, the Old Testament law declared that anyone who is hung from a tree is under God's curse. So such a remarkable darkness during Jesus' death seemed to confirm this mocking verdict of the passersby, all the chief priests and the robbers, that he was lying when he claimed to be Messiah and was getting the judgment of God that he deserved. And even Jesus confirms that he's under God's judgment. But this statement, it gives a really big twist to what it actually meant about Jesus. Jesus didn't deserve this. He didn't lie when he claimed to be Messiah, but that's what they started crucifying him for. It's the first verse. If you look at Psalms 22, it goes on to describe Jesus' crucifixion in vivid detail. If you look at Psalms, I think it's 22, Psalms 22, it's about 1,000 years before, and it's several hundred years before the crucifixion was even invented. So it's 1,000 years before Jesus was even crucified, and hundreds of years before the act of crucifixion was even invented. In other words, Jesus is disagreeing with his mockers. He is indeed under God's judgment, but far from proving that he's violating God's will as a Messiah's imposter, his crucifixion proves that he is the Messiah and that he's being crucified because he's obeying God's will. But why would it be God's will to execute his own Messiah? So to answer this, we need to look at the next dramatic event, which would be the torn temple curtain. So immediately after Jesus died, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now the Bible tells us that the temple curtain, it wasn't an ordinary curtain. It wasn't this little bitty curtain. It was 60 feet long, 30 feet high, and 4 inches thick. It was composed of 72 squares sewn together and was so heavy that it required 300 men to lift it. So, as you can see, for it to be torn from top to bottom, it would have to be a really big noteworthy event for them, especially for the Jewish people. The curtains really symbolize the separation that exists between God and us because of our sins. So, because God is holy and we're sinful, we're disqualified from coming into his presence to commune with him. Now, worshipers could only commune with God at this time indirectly through this ritual system. So, once a year, the high priest came into the Holy of Holies with the blood of an unblemished goat, and the death of the goat symbolically paid for their sins for that year. Now, of course, God doesn't really dwell in a cubicle. Sinful priests can't act as our mediator. And of course, as you know, animal blood doesn't really pay for human sin, but the entire temple system of the Old Testament was this really prophetic picture. It explained our dilemma with God, and it provided a picture of God's ultimate solution to the dilemma. And that's why they had to keep doing this over and over again. The Old Testament prophet Isaiah even predicted. He said one day that God's servant would come and fulfill the symbolism by laying his perfect life down for our sins. So that's a big, big parallel. That's a really big parallel. You can think about the sacrifice of the goat with all the blood of the unblemished goat, and it paid for their sins for that year. And then you think about Jesus' crucifixion in the New Testament and how his blood covered the sins of man, but not just for a year, just obviously forever. So now we're in this big position where we can understand the meaning of the temple curtain being torn and why Jesus was being judged by God, which was the darkness. And since it was torn at the moment of Jesus' death, it meant that Jesus was the servant, that his death paid the price for humanity's sins. And that means everybody can have a personal access to God through faith in Jesus. We don't have to go through this. We don't have to go through those old ways anymore. So what? What does this mean? So if you put your faith in Jesus' death, you can come confidently into God's presence at any time. You don't need an intercessor. Jesus' death forever removed the barrier that separates man from God. His death took God's judgment so we would never have to face it. His death has freed you forever from having to relate to God through peace and rituals, like I said. His death means that you never have to be afraid of relating to God because of your own moral failures. Now, the last event we're going to talk about is the earthquake and the empty tombs. Now, Jesus' death accomplished even more for us, and this is really indicated by this final dramatic event. You can read Matthew 27 to find out more about this. Now, the earthquake, it wasn't this ordinary earthquake. It happened right after Jesus' death, and it opened up these rock tombs near Golgotha. Now, the tombs of believers, probably people came to faith in Jesus as the Messiah during the public ministry. Now, 36 hours later, after Jesus had been resurrected, so 3 days later, they emerged from the cemetery and appeared to be people in Jerusalem who had known them. Now, not zombies, of course, it's not like The Walking Dead. But these people had been delivered from death. Now, if you look back at the Old Testament, we find the answer there again. According to the Old Testament, only the Messiah had the authority to call people from their graves. You can read about this in Daniel. Now, Jesus announced that as the Messiah, he would one day do this, and this event was evidently a preview of the end of the age. You can look back at Lazarus' resuscitation. This event, it powerfully demonstrated that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, and that his death has broken the power of death. It is our sins that bring us under death's power. Think about that. Since Jesus' death has paid for our sins, he delivers from death's power all who entrust themselves to him. So as you go through the week, I want you to take time to think about the humanity of Jesus, what went through his head leading up to his crucifixion. His fear, think about his fear, his pain. How scared would you be? Knowing that you were going to go through this, horrible pain. It was just beyond imaginable. We can't imagine it. It's not like Jesus was hung on the cross and then he died right away. He suffered. He suffered. He knew the end goal. He knew why he was doing it, to save man. But at the same time, all the pain, and not just physical pain, all the emotional pain he went through. I'm sure he felt, we know he felt betrayed. You can read that in the Bible. He felt betrayed, and, leaving all the people behind on earth too. It's like us when we die. We often think back to people that we love on earth and how, we're leaving them. And, there's got to be a bit of sadness with that. He's leaving all these people he'd come to love on earth. Now, he knew that what he was doing had to be done. But there were a lot of thoughts, like I said, thinking about the humanity of Jesus, there were a lot of thoughts that had to have went through his head during this time. And it's just something really to think about, something to think about as you go through the week.